In today's lesson, we'll be looking at the world's oil resources and examine some of the energy issues that come out of our reliance on oil and other fossil fuels. Fossil fuels played a vital role in promoting economic growth throughout the 20th century. It is because fossil fuels are so closely linked to development that they have been prized and defended by governments and been a source of geopolitical conflict for decades. But as fossil fuel supplies decline, and the impacts of climate change worsen, it is important to examine why we use fossil fuels, what they are, where they come from, and how we can expect to use them in the future. And we will be breaking today's lesson into the following broad categories. We will start by asking what fossil fuels are and why they are so valuable. Next, we will look at where we find oil on Earth. We will then learn about OPEC and its relationship to the world's oil supply. We will look at how the price of oil is determined. And finally, we'll end by looking at the future of oil. To begin, it's important to know what we are talking about when we refer to fossil fuels. Now, a fossil fuel is a natural fuel formed by geologic processes in the distant past from the remains of living organisms. So these are fuels that were formed millions of years ago, and they are non-renewable. We've been using them extensively for a couple hundred years, and we've exhausted most of the Earth's resources. It would take millions and millions of years for the Earth to build a supply back up. So for all intents and purposes, these are non-renewable. We're never going to get them back. And we can divide fossil fuels into three main categories. Oil, which will be the focus of our lesson today, natural gas, which we use for heating, and coal, which has played a big role in electricity production. Now, how is oil formed? The oldest known petroleum is about 500 million years old. Most oil was made from organisms, mostly things like algae, that decompose under saltwater oceans, again, millions of years ago. And over time, geologic processes turned them into the fossil fuels that we know today. Organic deposits were covered first by fine sands and muds, and then temperatures and pressure increased in sedimentary rock above and below the organic material, causing it to change into oil and gas deposits. Now, we have many uses for oil in today's society. Things like candles, fertilizers and pesticides, detergents, paints, dyes, makeups, synthetic fibers for clothing, medicine, synthetic rubber, food additives, plastic, photography, detergent, jet fuel, diesel fuel, and gasoline. And this is not a complete list. So we can see from here, though, that it's used across many different industries, and it's part of our everyday lives in many ways. But the most common use and the most politically important one is its use as a fuel source for our vehicles. Now, why are fossil fuels so valuable? Well, for one, historically, they've been very cheap. In Toronto, a liter of orange juice will cost you something like $3 for a liter. A carton of milk will cost maybe a little bit less than that. Gasoline, on the other hand, costs about $1 per liter. So even compared to other liquids, gasoline and other fossil fuels are very cheap. They are easy to convert into energy, and our cars rely upon them. So we have internal combustion engines, and all our cars run on them. We have infrastructure that relies on it. We have gas stations and oil companies whose vested interest is that we maintain and we keep using oil for the foreseeable future. And also, they have been readily available. We haven't run out of oil. So all of these factors lead us to continue to rely on fossil fuels. There's also lots of powerful interests that have a vested interest in oil. So there's the oil industry, the auto industry, petrochemical industries, and other manufacturers that, again, want to keep us using oil. It's in their best interest, their best financial interest. And a lot of these industries have a lot of sway politically. Now, oil was the fuel of the 20th century. Demand for oil has been increasing to supply energy needs for things like the internal combustion engine and for the petrochemical industry. However, today oil is only found in a few easily accessible places, and as time goes on, it's becoming harder and harder to access oil reserves. We've exhausted many of our conventional oil resources on land, and we have to start turning to harder to access locations in order to access oil. And this map here is showing us a location of known oil reserves throughout the world. And what you'll notice is that oil is not distributed evenly by any means. Places with oil have geopolitical influence because they can control the flow of energy. So for example, the US wants to maintain good relations with Middle Eastern countries because they have such high concentrations of oil reserves. So for example, their relationship with Saudi Arabia, they're willing to look the other way on human rights concerns because they have oil and it's in their best interest to be friends with this country. And then you have things like wars to protect those interests. So things like the Gulf War and the Iraq War, and diplomacy, so the Iran nuclear deal, that are influenced by the desire to keep the oil pumping. And so let's start in the Middle East. The Middle East has about over 60% of the world's known oil reserves. So they're very influential. Because they control so much of the production, these countries have a lot of control over global supply and therefore price. And these are very wealthy, oil-rich countries, places like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar. They have high GDPs and low unemployment rates. In fact, in many of these countries, they have to import migrant labor from elsewhere to meet the demand. So think back to the Nepali migrant workers working in Qatar. And many of these countries are members of OPEC, which we'll talk about later in the lesson, which help control the price of oil on the open market. Next, this map here is showing oil reserves in Central and South America, which is another hotspot for oil. And you'll see countries like Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Mexico, and Cuba with significant supplies. But by far the country here with the highest reserves is Venezuela. So Venezuela is one of the top 5 oil exporting countries in the world. They have some of the highest reserves in the world. And in Venezuela, oil is owned by the state. They have a socialist government. And oil is so important to the country that the army is used to protect installations, tankers, and refineries. However, this reliance on oil has led to an economic collapse in Venezuela in recent years. There's runaway inflation, high rates of poverty. The economy is failing very fast. And this kind of speaks to the dangers in relying on a single source, a single resource in your economy. Resource economies over time, if the price of that resource falls, your entire economy falls with it. Think back to resource towns and mining towns that are scattered throughout the Canadian North. And once the mine closes or the price of that resource drops too far, the mining town closes shop. Everyone moves out and it's a ghost town. In some ways, that's kind of what's happened to Venezuela on a national scale. As the price of oil has collapsed, all the revenue dried up. Europe is another hotspot with many known oil locations, particularly in Northern Europe in the North Sea. So oil and natural gas was first discovered in Europe in the 1970s in the North Sea, and there have been many projects to produce oil since the 1980s. Extracting oil and natural gas in the North Sea's inhospitable climate, however, requires sophisticated technology in order to mine this. So this means that oil from this region costs more than from other areas. And that's a trend we see with oil production, is that because we've exhausted the easy to find reserves, those on land, we have to turn to these harder to extract locations, places in more extreme climates, so in the Arctic or in the ocean, underwater. And countries that are benefiting from this include Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, and the United Kingdom. Another country with significant oil reserves is Russia. So Russia has constructed many pipelines throughout the country in order to export oil, and they control a large percentage of the world market. And they want to control their interests throughout Eurasia for this reason, because it's very central to the Russian economy to be able to export all of this oil. There's an importance of having access to seaports that's had an impact on many geopolitical stories over the past few years. So thinking about this was a major influence on their decision to annex Crimea. It was also one of the reasons why they got involved in Syria. In both cases, having control of that land, or at least having friendly relationships with the governments that control those territories, gives Russia access to seaports. However, reliance on oil and natural gas has made Russia vulnerable to the decrease in the price of oil over time. So those fluctuations, again, just like we saw with Venezuela, the price of oil goes down, the Russian economy can falter. And over the past few years, Russia's economy has taken a downturn with a severe recession. And it also leaves them vulnerable to U.S. sanctions, which again have crippled the Russian economy in many ways. So moving a little closer to home, Canada has plenty of oil reserves on its own. By most estimates, Canada has the third highest oil reserves in the world, behind only Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. And most of this oil is concentrated in the Alberta oil sands. And by most estimates, about 95% of Canada's reserves are found in the oil sands of Alberta. Now, the oil sands are grains of sand wrapped in water and oil. In order to extract the oil from the oil sands, this needs to be processed. So due to this separation of the three parts, it's very difficult and causes widespread environmental problems. It's also very costly to mine the oil sands. Again, this is not conventional crude oil. There's an extra manufacturing process that has to go into extracting the oil from the oil sands. And as a result of that, it's more expensive to mine this than conventional crude oil. So the price of oil has to already be very high for this to make economic sense. If the price of oil is low, then Alberta oil sands oil is not going to be economically competitive. There are also environmental impacts that we have to be aware of. So even the word oil sands, if you ask someone in the environmental movement, they would refer to these as the tar sands and say that that's a more apt description of these reserves. It's a very energy-intensive process in order to mine the oil sands because, again, they have to separate them. So you end up burning a lot of fuel just to mine. And there are also environmental impacts in terms of contaminants and runoff from the oil mining. There are also many economic impacts. So reliance on oil has caused Alberta's economy to enter a recession, and that affects all of Canada. So while the price of oil was higher in the early 2010s, Canada's economy was doing fairly well. For a period, in fact, the Canadian dollar was worth more than the US dollar for a brief period, or at least on par. In 2017, Canadian dollar is at about 70 cents for a US dollar. And the reason for that, again, the reliance on oil, it ends up impacting the entire Canadian economy. And this was one of the criticisms of the Harper government's reliance on oil. When the times are good and oil's booming, things are great. When the price of oil drops, the economy suffers. But the oil sands are not the only place in Canada where we find oil. There's also oil on the east coast, off the coast of Newfoundland. So in 1997, Newfoundland became an oil producer with the opening of the Hibernia offshore oil project. And today, oil is more important to Newfoundland's economy than fishing, which had been the dominant industry in Newfoundland for centuries. Now that we know where oil is found, let's look at one of the most significant petroleum organizations in the world, OPEC. So OPEC, which stands for the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, is an international organization that's meant to coordinate and unify petroleum policies among member countries in order to secure fair and stable prices for petroleum producers. It's an efficient, economic, and to regulate the supply of petroleum to consuming nations, and a fair return on capital to those investing in the industry. So this is not all oil-producing countries in the world. This is a select few that have come together and joined this organization. So you can see many of these countries are concentrated in the Middle East. many of those Middle Eastern oil-producing countries, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, Qatar, the UAE, and then some South American countries, Venezuela and Ecuador. If we look over to Southeast Asia, Indonesia is a member of OPEC. Essentially, this organization acts as a cartel. They can increase or decrease production in order to affect the price of oil worldwide. If they want the price of oil, they think it's advantageous for it to go higher, they decrease the supply in order to raise the price. If they want to lower the price of oil for whatever reason, they can just increase supply, which is what's happened over the past few years. And this allows these countries to exert geopolitical influence by controlling the price of oil, or at least having a very high influence on it. Now that leads us to the question of how the price of oil is determined in the first place. And like most economic questions, it's a matter of supply and demand. Organizations and countries control the cost of oil by limiting the supply to the world market. If oil supply and infrastructure is disrupted for any reason, the price could also go up. So examples might be things like war, natural disasters, and geopolitical conflicts. Now, prices can fluctuate quite wildly over time in response to major events and disruptions. So this graph here is showing the change in oil prices in the past 150 years. And you can see it's varied quite wildly over time. The blue line here is showing in nominal dollars the price of oil, so in actual dollars what it would have cost you. The red line is looking at real dollars, so adjusted for inflation. You can see, again, over time this has changed wildly. And even over a shorter term, these fluctuations can be extreme. So again, in real dollars, adjusted for inflation, oil has been as high as $145 per barrel and as low as $30 per barrel over just the past 30 years. And even within a year, we can see these kind of wild fluctuations. Take 2008, for example. This is the year when the U.S. housing market collapsed and the start of the Great Recession. Well, during that year, oil reached a peak of $145 per barrel. That same year, it hit a low of $32 per barrel. So even in a short period of time, in reaction to an event like a stock market crash, it could be in response to a major military conflict, these kinds of things can cause the price of oil to change rapidly. The current price of oil, as of January 2017, is hovering around $55 per barrel. So still not anywhere near the peak that it reached in the late 2000s, but not quite at where the low was. And this price has been on the rise for the past year or so. Now, with that in mind, we have to ask ourselves, what is the future of oil? As the costs of renewable energy continue to drop and countries react to climate change, countries are starting to prepare for reducing or eliminating their dependence on oil. There's also this idea of peak oil, which is a point at which oil production reaches a peak from which it can never recover, because again, oil is a non-renewable resource. At some point, we will run out of it. And some analysts have suggested this has already happened. So this graph here is showing reserves of oil, how much we have extracted over the past 150 years compared to what we can expect to continue to produce in the coming 2 centuries based on known reserves. And you can see here, we are kind of in the period where we've reached peak production of oil. This is what the idea of peak oil is suggesting. It follows a standard bell curve, and we can expect it to decline considerably in the coming decades because future discoveries cannot keep up with demand, and production will just keep dropping and dropping and dropping considerably. So this is something we have to keep in mind and something we have to prepare for as oil supplies continue to dwindle throughout time. So in summary, oil was the most important fuel of the 20th century and has many uses. Oil was formed from the remains of dead sea life, such as algae, and over millions of years their fossilized remains transformed into oil. OPEC is an international cartel of major oil-producing countries that helps control the price of oil. Oil prices are influenced by a variety of factors, including war, natural disasters, and geopolitical conflict. Areas of the world with major oil reserves include the Middle East, Russia, and Canada. And oil is a finite resource, and within the coming decades, we will reach peak oil, the point at which oil production begins a permanent decline.